Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker does a lot of things. Not only does it bring a close to the Skywalker Saga, but it also brought a ton of awesome Easter eggs and little details to the screen that you might not have noticed upon your initial viewing, or your second, or third, or even fourth. Let's be honest, Star Wars fans like watching these movies over and over again, so odds are you'll probably see it at least a couple of times. And you know that we here at Screen Rant love our Easter eggs. So of course we're going to take a look at a bunch of them and where you could see them for yourself upon your next viewing. Also, as you would probably expect, this video is going to be chock full of a bunch of spoilers. So if you haven't seen the movie for whatever reason, go watch it first, then come back to this video. We'll be waiting.
What are you doing there, 3PO?
Taking one last look, sir.
You know that planet at the beginning of the film, where we see Kylo Ren fighting some random dudes in an ashy-looking forest while he was searching for the Sith MacGuffin that he needed to go find the Emperor? It was a pretty cool-looking place to be sure, but did it feel kind of familiar to you at all? Well, it might just have, as we have seen this planet before, though it looked a bit more lava-y when we last saw it. Yeah, this planet is indeed Mustafar, the planet upon which Anakin Skywalker, now Darth Vader, faced off with Obi-Wan Kenobi way back in Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Makes sense that this would be one of the places where a Wayfinder could be found, since Vader made this planet his home when he built his castle there, as we saw in Rogue One, a Star Wars story. Exegol might be quite a bit different from the expanded universe version of the Sith homeworld that many of us grew up with, Korriban. The climate is a bit more thundery and a whole lot more blue, but the two different versions do at least have some similar aesthetic features, such as giant statues of ancient Sith Lords, including some that bear a striking resemblance to Knights of the Old Republic 2, the Sith Lord's villain, Darth Nihilus. But more important is the temple itself, which looks quite a bit like the temple we saw in Star Wars Rebels on the planet Malachor, which does make a little bit of sense, but it's still nice to see a little nod to the popular animated series. Let's stay on Exegol for just a little bit longer here, and talk about the actual throne of the Sith. This fancy looking chair isn't just the seat of power for the entire Sith Empire. It is also a reference to the amazing work of artist Ralph McQuarrie. McQuarrie worked on concept art for the original Star Wars trilogy, and the Sith throne looks quite similar to the design that he did for Return of the Jedi of the Emperor's throne on the Death Star. That's a nice little nod to this amazing artwork. With Palpatine coming back in this film, marking the third time that he's appeared as the big bad guy in the third film in a trilogy, naturally there needed to be some explanation as to how he was still around. You know, after he fell down a seemingly bottomless pit and then exploded. This explanation comes in the form of Palpatine saying a single, simple phrase. The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural. Now, if you're a prequel memer or just somebody who enjoys those films, you'll recognize this, as it is of course exactly what Palpatine told Anakin back in Episode 3 when he was talking about the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise. Oh, so that's what he meant by that. You know the visions that Rey gets when she touches specific items, like Luke's old lightsaber in The Force Awakens or the Sith dagger in Rise of Skywalker? Looking at that, you might think that it's just a means of moving the plot forward. Which, I mean, you're not wrong, but this is actually a power that we've seen other people use. The most recent example being Cal Kestis in the game Jedi Fallen Order, who had similar visions upon touching objects himself, such as the lightsaber of one of Vader's Jedi hunting Inquisitors. So it's not just a special ability of Rey or anything like that, it's a genuine Force ability. Neat! While searching for clues to lead our heroes to the Sith Wayfinder, they find their way to the desert planet of Pasaana. How many desert planets are there in this galaxy anyways? Upon arriving, they discover that they have arrived smack dab in the middle of a large festival, which I am choosing to call Space Burning Man because that's exactly what it looks like. It is stated that the festival takes place once every 42 years, which is itself a nod to the original Star Wars film. See, Rise of Skywalker came out in 2019. And A New Hope hit theaters back in 1977, the two films being separated by 42 years. What may have initially seemed like just a random number actually has a lot of significance. Rey's ability to use the Force to heal people may seem to have just kinda came out of nowhere, but it is actually a power that has long been established in Star Wars lore. In the now non-canon Legends continuity, Force Heal was a fairly common ability that Jedi could use, with the video games really leaning on this ability as a way of balancing gameplay. However, a day or so before the Rise of Skywalker hit theaters, The Mandalorian brought the ability into the main canon, as Episode 7 saw everyone's favorite Baby Yoda using the power to heal Carl Weathers after a rather nasty monster attack. So the power actually has a pretty long history backing it up. Rise of Skywalker introduced audiences to yet another adorable little droid buddy for our heroes, this time in the form of the traffic cone on top of a wheel of cheese that is D0. This little guy breaks from traditional astromech style droids like R2-D2 or BB-8 in that he can actually speak to a limited degree. And if you're the kind of person who watches a ton of interviews with the cast and crew of the movie, you might actually recognize the voice, as Dio is voiced by none other than the film's director himself, J.J. Abrams. And if Dio was here right now, we'd like to think that he would tell you to subscribe to Screen Rant and hit that little bell thingy for more videos like this. And also that you should probably turn on your notifications if you're watching this on mobile. Dio just seems like a cool dude like that. The power creep in Star Wars may seem like it has started to get just a little bit absurd over the last few years, but honestly, a lot of what we see on screen has some basis in other Star Wars stories. One scene in The Rise of Skywalker that has people talking is when Rey reached out with the Force and tried pulling down a troop carrier. Now, obviously this is a pretty amazing feat, and if you're at all like us, it probably made you initially think of The Force Unleashed, when Starkiller tried to do something similar, but with an entire Imperial Star Destroyer. Did you know though that such an ability is within the new canon as well? As Luke Skywalker allegedly used the Force to pull down a Star Destroyer in the novel, The Legends of Luke Skywalker. So power creep is real, but it's not just in the films. When you think of Star Wars, odds are you think of a few things. Lightsabers, beloved characters and storylines, and of course, John Williams' iconic score. Well, with The Rise of Skywalker serving as the final Star Wars film that Williams will work on, it was fitting that the famed composer finally got a cameo in the film. On the planet Kijimi, when our heroes make their way into a cantina, look at who is behind the bar. Yep, it is none other than John Williams himself. He simply glares at the heroes, and then the scene moves on. It might be a really small part, but it's still nice to see him there, regardless. Sticking around on Kijimi, let's talk about some of the background items in Babu Frick's workshop. Specifically one droid that you might not have noticed in the background of the shot when C-3PO was getting worked on. Look closely in the background, and you will see one of the Trade Federation battle droids hanging out back there. Now these droids numbered in the millions, if not billions or possibly even trillions during the Clone Wars. So it makes sense that at least a few would be hanging around, especially in a droid mechanic's workshop. And it's actually pretty nice to see some direct references to the prequels in this sequel trilogy. When Rey was climbing her way through the wreckage of the second Death Star, we get to see a lot of old relics from the Battle of Endor. Classic stormtrooper armor littered the battered halls, and crashed TIE fighters sat broken in what remains of the docking bay. And a very familiar looking tower looms large in the background. Looking behind Rey in this shot, we can see a pillar similar to the one that Obi-Wan climbed around in A New Hope to deactivate the tractor beam. Guess the Imperial engineers really didn't change much about the design of the interiors of the station between the first and the second one. After having her big battle with Kylo Ren, and feeling the loss of Leia via the Force, Rey decides to make like Luke Skywalker and recuse herself on Ahch-To. As she is burning Ren's ship, she goes to throw her saber into the fire, only for it to be caught by good old Ghost Luke, who comments about how she should have more respect for the weapon of a Jedi. This is a little bit of a meta throwback to Star Wars: The Last Jedi, where he himself disrespected the very same saber. Can't help but feel like this moment is nothing more than a subtle jab at the much maligned film, especially with how much Star Wars fans complained about that specific moment in that movie. Speaking of The Last Jedi, while the remaining members of the Resistance are discussing their plan for taking down the Final Order fleet, one of their members mentions the possibility of pulling off a Holdo maneuver, referencing Admiral Holdo's actions at the end of The Last Jedi, where she flew a ship through the First Order fleet at hyperspeed, just completely ruining their day. Someone then comments that the move is a 1 in a million kind of move, explaining why it had never really been done in the Star Wars universe. And overall, it is nice to see that Holdo's sacrifice has been honored by the Resistance by them naming an entire maneuver after her. So despite being a character for only a single film, she did manage to leave a bit of a mark on the Star Wars universe. During that same scene, we also see a Mon Calamari member of the Resistance. Many of you may not really know who this is, but he is actually connected to a fan favorite character. Everyone knows who Admiral Akbar is. Yep, the It's a Trap guy himself. While he may have shuffled off this mortal coil in The Last Jedi, it is his son that gets the chance to shine in The Rise of Skywalker, even for just this brief moment. Yep, that is Aftab Akbar, and he is actually voiced by scriptwriter Chris Terrio. Boom! Double detail for you there. When Lando and Chewie successfully return from gathering basically anyone with a ship in the galaxy that could fight, we get a ton of fan favorite ships that eagle-eyed viewers could spot. And when we say there are a lot, we really mean it. Some of the highlights include the Outrider, a Corellian YT-2400 from the expanded universe novel Shadows of the Empire, a Lucre Hulk droid control ship, the same kind we saw blockading Naboo in The Phantom Menace, at least one Venerator-class Star Destroyer from the Clone Wars, and a VCX-100 light freighter, which could quite possibly be the Ghost from Star Wars Rebels. Let us know if you see any ships that we missed. In addition to an entire, impossibly large fleet, Lando also brought a veteran member of the Rebellion to the fight, in the form of Wedge Antilles. Wedge was probably the rebel pilot during the original trilogy, serving as the Rebellion's version of Poe Dameron in their fight against the Empire. When the sequel trilogy rolled around, the character was completely absent, with not even a mention occurring. So it was nice to see him finally make his way back into the fight. Meanwhile, down on the Sith homeworld, Rey and Kylo were having a heck of a time dealing with the newly powered up Palpatine, which found Rey staring up into the sky, quickly losing hope. This is when she hears the voices of a bunch of past Jedi. And this is yet another opportunity for superfans to completely nerd out, as in addition to the expected Yoda and Obi-Wan cameos, we also get the voices of people such as Mace Windu, Qui-Gon Jinn, Anakin Skywalker himself, and even some animated-only characters like Freddie Prinze Jr. as Kanan Jarrus and Ashley Eckstein as Ahsoka Tano. And it's Ahsoka's inclusion here that is, while exciting in its own right, kind of sad actually, as it infers that Ahsoka seemingly passed away at some point between the end of Rebels and the sequel trilogy. So while it's good to hear her on the big screen, it's still a bit of a bummer. After the Final Order's defeat, the Resistance is seen celebrating at their base, and keen-eyed observers may have noticed that a certain Broadway star was hanging around during the celebration. If you look closely, you can clearly see Hamilton's Lin-Manuel Miranda sharing in the festivities. It was nice to see the musician and actor in the film, but this cameo wasn't the only bit of work that he did on the movie. Miranda actually revealed that he wrote a piece of music for The Rise of Skywalker. While we don't yet fully know for sure what piece of music he penned, our best guess is that he wrote the music for the sequence on Pasaana, you know, the space Burning Man that we mentioned earlier. He also wrote a piece of music for The Force Awakens, specifically the music that can be heard in the background at Maz Kanata's place while Solo and the crew are hanging out. So it is nice to see Miranda finally get to make an appearance on screen in person, as opposed to just as a background voice on some music track. Now we need to take a second to talk about the very end of the film. After burying Luke and Leia's sabers in the desert outside of the old Lars homestead, we get a quick look at Rey's new lightsaber. Built out of parts of her staff that she had in her possession since The Force Awakens, this new saber is rocking a rather unexpected color. Instead of the usual blue or green of the Jedi, Rey's lightsaber is in fact yellow. Now, within the current canon, a Jedi's lightsaber color actually says quite a bit about who that person is, as the kyber crystal in their saber is imbued with their Force essence during the construction of the weapon. Each color has its own meaning behind it. Too much for us to really get into here in this video. So if you want us to do a video on the subject, like this video. Maybe we'll go ahead and just break all the colors down. Yellow, though, is definitely a bit of an odd one out. In the past, the only people that we really saw using the color were the Jedi Temple guards. So what does this say about Rey? Well, we would argue that her having the color yellow is representative of her role as the last Jedi. She is the last member of the Ancient Order, so she is sort of the guardian of the teachings, which she has in common with the Temple guards. Just kind of a thought, but it makes sense to us. Either way, it is just cool to see yet another color added to the films.
The Rise of Skywalker has had fans wondering for months who that Skywalker might be. Well, it's exactly who you thought it would be, but not how you expected. Be warned that spoilers will follow. Rise of Skywalker had the potential to end this trilogy by orienting it towards the future, but instead it gets bogged down in the franchise's past and turns Rey Palpatine's Skywalker into a clunky mouthful of a tribute. But it didn't have to be this way. The Rise of Skywalker is not only the conclusion to a trilogy, but the conclusion to a trilogy of trilogies. Shaping more than 40 years of movie plots, peripheral lore, and lifelong fan expectation into one satisfying film was never gonna be easy. But Disney is just eating itself, stifling the creative freedom and new ideas that it needs to stay relevant in the long term. As of the time of writing this video, Disney has pretty much fired 4 directors. Josh Tank from an unnamed Star Wars spin-off, Phil Lord and Chris Miller from Solo: A Star Wars Story, and Colin Trevorrow from Rise of Skywalker. Plus, they forced Gareth Edwards, the director of Rogue One, to be babysat by another director, Tony Gilroy, after deeming his original cut unacceptable. Firing a director midway through a film is no big thing the first time it happens. Sometimes things just don't work out. The second time, it's an odd coincidence. The third time is, at the very least, a pattern. Although it's understandable that a franchise with this much history and money on the line is tightly controlled, Disney's director firing fixation may actually be hurting them in the long run. Take Solo: A Star Wars Story, for example. The original writing and directing team, Phil Lord and Chris Miller, made their name either writing or directing modern comedy classics like 21 Jump Street, The Lego Movie, and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Taking a character and a franchise like Spider-Man and making a movie as ambitious and conceptually off the wall as Spider-Verse, from a studio's perspective, that's a huge gamble. But it paid off, and that's why Disney hired them in the first place, for their ability to breathe truly new life into an old franchise. When it came down to it though, it turned out that Disney's eyes were bigger than their stomach, and they just weren't ready to relinquish creative control. Apparently they felt that Lord and Miller were leaning too far towards comedy and improv on set. So for the last few weeks, they brought in the industry vet Ron Howard to rework the film into something safer. The movie turned out to be just okay. It was at best an easy way to kill a few hours, but the corporate creative control kept it from being something amazing. The same thing happened with The Rise of Skywalker. The original director, Colin Trevorrow, was fired for being, and this is a real quote, difficult. This probably means that he was trying to be more creative with the trilogy's conclusion, to take some liberties with the lore the same way Rian Johnson did in The Last Jedi. Needless to say, Disney wasn't happy, so they fired him and replaced him with a safer bet, J.J. Abrams. After Rian Johnson started to take the series in an interesting new directions, a lot of grouchy old fans got mad, and unfortunately, Disney listened. Instead of following the ideas from The Last Jedi to their logical conclusion, Rise of Skywalker ended up being a try-hard patch-up job. The movie walked back every single interesting and controversial element brought out in Episode 8. Take Rey's lineage, for example. Originally, she was supposed to be the exceptional child of some unexceptional parents. If they had kept it that way, it would have opened so many new doors for the franchise. Force sensitivity wouldn't have had to be a hereditary chosen one style trait, but instead they resurrected an old villain who was supposed to be dead and made him Rey's grandpa. This wasn't the original idea for the film. Trevorrow told Empire that bringing back the Emperor was an idea JJ brought to the table when he came on board. Instead of finishing the story they started, they restarted an old story that was supposed to be finished, opting for fan service instead of something new. The dynamic between Rey and Palpatine is also strikingly similar to the one between Luke and his dad. Almost the whole plot is like this, a tribute to the original trilogy instead of a conclusion to the new one. They brought back Lando Calrissian to save the day. Leia, Han Solo, and Luke all appear as ghosts. And lest we forget, Palpatine was resurrected after being chucked off a cliff and exploded. And then there are the cop-outs. The red lightsaber Rey that everyone was expecting from the trailers turned out to be the oldest cop-out in the book, Dark Rey. The movie could have made the daring choice to have her actually choose a side or even actually die, but they opted to revive her and give her a yellow lightsaber, which means there's finally balance in the Force? Probably not, because there's another trilogy on the horizon. To be fair, making a Star Wars movie in 2019 is a thankless lose-lose job, and this could have been a lot worse. Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker ended a 42-year saga. And although we know this doesn't mean the end of the Star Wars franchise, the film has been marketed as a definitive resolution. But tying up 4 decades of loose ends is no easy task, and so naturally, the last third of the movie was a little bit confusing. So let's work through this all together. In the final scene, Rey and BB-8 return to Luke's home planet, Tatooine, to bury his and Leia's lightsabers, and along with them, the Skywalker era. But then when she's asked what her name is, Rey looks knowingly at the ghosts of Luke and Leia and replies James Bond style, Rey Skywalker. Is she saying, Luke, you are my father? Not really. Her real father is exactly who the last movie said he was, a nobody. But her father's father is Emperor Palpatine. So Luke isn't actually her father, but he is her spiritual forefather in a way. She's taking on the name of her chosen family, the Jedi. But she's also taking the Force in a new direction because, as we also see in this scene, she's got a yellow lightsaber. We've seen this color of lightsaber once before in the Star Wars universe. In the Clone Wars, they're wielded by the Sentinels. But presumably Rey's saber isn't meant to be a reference to them. It seems to represent the Force being balanced, or at least refreshed or something. As the only person left who's able to use the Force, or so we're led to believe, Rey had the pick of any color, and her decision to go yellow is probably meant as a disavowal of the past. She wants to move on from the simplistic black and white, or I guess blue and red, of the Star Wars past. She doesn't represent a council, a republic, an order, or a resistance. She simply represents herself. In keeping with this, her new yellow lightsaber isn't made from the high-tech brushed metal of lightsabers past. It's a repurposed version of the wooden staff she used before upgrading to the iconic plasma blade. So it's at once a tribute to her humble beginnings, but also to all those across the galaxy who were born into similar circumstances. And then there are the resurrections. To even appear in this movie and reveal himself as the true architect of this whole trilogy, Palpatine had to be resurrected. After Kylo breaks good, him and Rey go toe-to-toe with her grandpa, who flings Kylo off of a cliff. And then Rey, using the last of her energy, reverses Palpatine's lightning right back at him, which proves too much for Palpatine, but also Rey. But then it turns out that Kylo's not dead, as he climbs back up and uses the last of his energy to revive Rey, after which he is gone for good. Also, for most of the movie, everyone thinks that Chewbacca bit the dust in an exploding ship, but it turns out he was actually in a different but similar looking ship that didn't explode. There are also tons of Force ghosts here. Luke, Leia, and kinda Han return from the other side to dispense wisdom and even at one point freeze Kylo for a second so that Rey can skewer him with a lightsaber. But of course she resurrects him, patching his wound. So just to recap who's alive and who isn't at the end of the movie, Rey and Chewbacca are alive. Palpatine, Luke, Leia, and Kylo are not. Got it? But what about that love triangle? In a nod to the originals minus the sibling thing, both Poe and Finn are obviously infatuated with Rey. This has been going on since The Force Awakens, and with the trilogy coming to an end, everyone thought that The Rise of Skywalker would resolve it. But even after some posturing between Finn and Poe that seems to be about Rey, it never really comes up again. And at the end, when everyone is reunited, Rey hugs Finn and Poe at the same time, which will only add fuel to the fanfiction fire. Rian Johnson, who directed The Last Jedi and the amazing recent murder mystery Knives Out, is already working on the 4th Star Wars trilogy. Although it could just be a spin-off or a prequel, could The Rise of Skywalker be setting up an expansive Star Wars cinematic universe? Most definitely. We leave Rey just as her character is coming into herself and becoming really interesting. Right after she leaves the blue and red binary behind for the morally ambiguous yellow. Finn feels relatively unexplored, and if you've seen Attack the Block, you'll know that John Boyega is more than capable of carrying his own film. And he'd be a great team with Janna, who's also a reformed stormtrooper. We also get a quick introduction to Zori Bliss, an old flame of Poe's, who would be incredible in her own spin-off or as a Bonnie and Clyde style team with her ex.
But Master Yoda said I should be mindful of the future. but not at the expense of the moment.
You know what is one of the benefits of creating a series completely out of order? Not only can you put out the best parts first, hooking people on your story so they have to watch all of the preceding entries, but you can also retroactively add in some sweet moments of foreshadowing in the prequel films that you make later. Seems that George Lucas realized this as he managed to add in a lot of small moments that contained connections to future films and, of course, the original trilogy. Is it foreshadowing if it's connected to something that's already happened? Past shadowing? That sounds just a little bit weird, though it is more accurate. Whatever. We'll just go with foreshadowing for now.
Oh, I have a bad feeling about this.
So let's take a look at a handful of moments of foreshadowing that you may have missed in the prequel trilogy, and see what they were trying to tell us.
I will do what I must.
Let's start things out with The Phantom Menace, everyone's favorite Star Wars film. So if you have spent any amount of time on the internet as a Star Wars fan, you've probably heard 80,000 people mention how George Lucas said way back when, during production of the prequels, that good stories should rhyme. Most of the time, the references to this line are done in jest. However, here we have a case where George put his money where his mouth was. In The Phantom Menace, at the very beginning, we see Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi boarding the Trade Federation ship in order to negotiate an end to the conflict between the Trade Federation and Naboo. In Return of the Jedi, we see C-3PO and R2-D2 entering Jabba's palace in order to try to negotiate the end of the conflict between Jabba and Han Solo. Seems rather similar. And even the visuals bear a striking resemblance to each other, with the hallways of both locations sharing similar architecture. Reference or retroactive foreshadowing? We'll leave that up to you. Either way, this is one time when the saga most definitely rhymed. The Phantom Menace added a lot of details to the franchise that, love them or hate them, are official canon, and really expanded the backstories of a lot of our favorite characters.
Thank you, R2-D2.
One such example is the Golden Protocol droid himself, C-3PO, who had his very creation shown in Episode 1. Back then though, he wasn't quite so golden yet. In fact, he had no body plates at all. We are, of course, talking about when it was revealed that little Anakin Skywalker indeed built the droid. Now, this bit of foreshadowing isn't about the protocol unit, but rather its creator. A Reddit user named ChildPlease7 argued that this revelation wasn't just a cutesy way to introduce the fan-favorite robot, but a way of foreshadowing young Anakin's future as a bit of a robot himself. See, he always found more comfort around machines than the other children on Tatooine, and it was this lack of human empathy and connection to others that started him on his path towards becoming Darth Vader. That's some crazy stuff. Speaking of Anakin and droids, it is quite possible, in fact we're going to go ahead and say that it's pretty much a complete and total fact, that Anakin's interest in machines, specifically droids in this case, is a sign of his need for control as an adult. Now what do we mean here? Well, it's rather simple. Look at Revenge of the Sith. Look at Anakin's fall. It was caused by him feeling as if he didn't have control over his future, over his position within the Jedi, over whether or not his wife was going to survive childbirth. So he went ahead and became Darth Vader, a role that allowed him some semblance of control. Look at how he was as a child. He didn't have any sort of say over his life. He was a slave, which means he had to do what other people told him to do. And he was a child, which in of itself comes without much freedom. But as a builder, around technology, he had all the power then, hence why he may have been just a little bit obsessed. Star Wars is well known for a lot of things. Awesome action, fantastic adventures, eye-wateringly cool laser swords, and of course the music. John Williams' scores are instantly recognizable and iconic. Play basically any song from any of the films, and odds are someone around you will know exactly which film in the saga it was from. Which makes it sort of odd when specific themes are reused in what seems to be completely different contexts. But how different are they really? Look at the scene in The Phantom Menace when the droid army is unleashed upon the fields of Naboo. During that moment, a specific musical cue began to play. We'd play it for you here, but you know, copyright and all that. Pretty sure you know which one we're talking about. Nowhere else you could hear that exact musical cue when the clone troopers were introduced in Attack of the Clones. This subtle bit of musical play goes a long way to highlight the darker future that the clones will play a part in bringing about. It also shows that, despite being on opposite sides of the war, the droids and the clones are both simply puppets of Darth Sidious and his evil machinations. As moviegoers, we all basically knew how things were going to play out in the prequel trilogy before we even saw them, in that we knew that it would all eventually lead to the rise of Darth Vader, the Emperor, and the Galactic Empire. It could be argued though that Qui-Gon may have also known where things were going. At least he did a dang good job of foreshadowing the future when he said what is perhaps one of the most memed lines in the entire franchise.
Hello there.
There's always a bigger fish. While in this case he was obviously talking about the giant fish that they had just saw eat a smaller one, it could be argued that the line was drawing attention to how there was going to be a bigger threat than the ones that we see. The Phantom Menace gave us Darth Maul, Attack of the Clones gave us Count Dooku, but behind them all though was the bigger fish, that being Darth Sidious, the biggest fish. Joking aside, Qui-Gon obviously didn't know that, but it's still a cool bit of foreshadowing regardless. Moving on to Attack of the Clones, we should take a look at what was the true main point of that second film, that being the love story between Anakin and Padme. As we all know, these two lovers were not exactly destined to have a happily ever after.
You thunder against me!
You have done that yourself.
However, the very scenes themselves showcase the sort of doomed nature of their relationship. Look at the earlier scenes. They are bright and vivid, with colors just all over the place, showing the relative innocence of what's going on. However, as their relationship gets more and more serious, the mood shifts, with darker colors not only in terms of lighting and backgrounds, but also Padme's outfits. Looking at this, you can clearly see things moving more and more into a darker direction, which would ultimately lead to the dark end of their relationship. Can't get much darker than passing away because of a broken heart. Brutal. You know that very, very famous poster for The Phantom Menace, where the younger child version of Anakin cast a long shadow on a nearby wall? You know, the one that bore a resemblance to Darth Vader, showing us all that this little blonde kid was going to eventually become the most feared villain in the entire galaxy? Well, did you know that there was a similar shadow in Attack of the Clones? While Anakin and Padme are chilling on Tatooine later on in the film, the dual sunset causes the young Jedi to cast a shadow against a nearby wall. That's definitely looking like the Dark Lord of the Sith himself. Also helps the moment that Anakin's time on Tatooine in this film is probably one of the darkest moments in the entire prequel trilogy.
They're like animals, and I slaughtered them like animals.
After Anakin and Padme made their way to Geonosis in order to try to rescue Obi-Wan from the clutches of the evil Separatists, they fail pretty miserably.
Then we decided to come and rescue you.
Good job.
Now finding themselves in need of a rescue, the two, along with Obi-Wan, were chained up in the middle of the Geonosis arena. Look at how they're arranged, with Anakin in the middle and Padme and Obi-Wan on either side of him. This is an interesting way of arranging them, as it foreshadows the conflict raging within Anakin. On one hand, you have Anakin's loyalty to the Jedi Order, in this case represented by his master and old friend, Obi-Wan. On the other hand is his budding relationship with Padme, which flies in the face of the established rules of the Order. Jedi aren't really supposed to love, and yet, here he is. This symbolized the struggles that Anakin will have to deal with for the rest of the trilogy, so it's a pretty cool little visual metaphor. No matter whether you're looking at things through the lens of the now non-canon expanded universe or the current canon, the color of a Jedi's lightsaber actually tells you quite a bit about who that Jedi is, and what mindset they currently have. Throughout the prequel trilogy, Obi-Wan and Anakin both rocked the classic, deep blue color that we most associate with the Jedi. Symbolically, this shows that the two of them were connected on a deep level. They were master and apprentice, sure, but it was more than that. They were comrades in arms, friends, brothers even. Throughout the trilogy, for the most part, they shared the same ideals and priorities. However, at one point in Attack of the Clones, Anakin was not as in sync with Obi-Wan as he was earlier, right around the time that he was given a green blade. While yeah, he didn't get to choose the color of the replacement lightsaber he was given by a random Jedi bro, we are talking symbolism here, people, and that is about as symbolic as things can get. And yeah, by the beginning of Revenge of the Sith, Anakin was back to blue again, but you could argue that was because the Clone Wars brought the two back together again. Or they could just have needed him to have a blue blade so it could be given to Luke later. Either or. Remember earlier how we were talking about that whole good stories have to rhyme spiel that George Lucas was such a fan of? Well, that came in full force in Revenge of the Sith. At the very beginning of the film, we get a rather quick lightsaber duel between Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Count Dooku. When the duel comes to an end, Anakin is put into a position where he is given the choice to either spare Dooku or end him right then and there. If you've seen this film, which we certainly hope you have at this point, you know which way the future Lord of the Sith goes. Jumping a few films forward to Return of the Jedi, we saw Luke in a similar situation, standing over Darth Vader, his life literally in Luke's hands, and goaded on by Palpatine, just like Anakin was in Episode 3.
Fulfill your destiny. Do it.
However, Luke made a different choice, staying on the path of light. That's a great example of Lucas repeating similar setups, but changing things up slightly to show the differences between the two trilogies. And also a great bit of foreshadowing if you are watching the saga for the first time in numbered order. Speaking of old Sheevy, you ever notice that all of his apprentices in the prequel trilogy kind of resemble Darth Vader in some ways? Oh, you didn't? Well, let's break it all down for you then. See, Darth Maul is fairly similar to Vader in terms of his overall presence. Maul is a representation of Vader's rage and connection to the dark side of the Force. Dooku is a representation of Anakin's split from the Jedi. In case you didn't know, Dooku was actually a former Jedi himself, who left the Order years before to take up his royal birthright. However, he also secretly fell to the dark side, becoming Darth Tyrannus. And finally, there is General Grievous, who, while not technically an apprentice of Palpatine, definitely has some connections to Darth Vader as a character. Mainly the fact that he was a formerly organic being transformed into an augmented, cybernetic villain. More machine than man, or alien. Seems that Palpatine definitely has a type when it comes to his underlings. Anakin's fall to the dark side may have seemed to be a bit quick in Revenge of the Sith, seemingly happening over the course of just a couple of minutes. And yeah, it was relatively quick, but if you had been paying attention during the entire prequel trilogy, some of the things he did after he fell wouldn't have really surprised you very much. First, he said, "No one can kill a Jedi," which,
There are too many of them. What are we going to do?
Yeah, that line aged like a fine 2% milk left out in the hot summer sun. Woof. How about another line, eh? Something like, "I'd much rather dream about Padme." I mean, we'd rather dream about Natalie Portman too, but not when the dream is a vision of her passing away during childbirth. A believable enough one, by the way, to drive someone to the dark side. Okay, so how about one more? Let's see if we can go for a hat trick. Oh, we got one. "I want to be the first one to see them all." Them all here referring to the stars, by the way. This one is a bit less straightforward, but as the Dark Lord of the Sith, Vader traveled all over the galaxy doing the bidding of the Emperor. So in a way, he probably did see them all, if not at least a metric ton of them. So we guess you really should be careful what you wish for there, Annie. In life, we often find ourselves saying goodbye to someone only to never see them again because life drags us apart in unexpected ways. It's a part of growing older, we guess. Sad, but a reality. It's even sadder when it's a good friend. Now, just imagine if that good friend then goes on to become the most hated and feared being in the known galaxy, and your little green friend wants you to hunt them down and take them out permanently. Well, that's what happened to Obi-Wan, and the final scene where they face each other as friends before everything goes down is retroactively pretty sad. Made even more so by Obi-Wan's final, unknowing words before they became bitter enemies.
Goodbye, old friend. May the Force be with you.
Also, it's worth pointing out that this scene has some foreshadowing that isn't strictly just in that one line from Obi-Wan. If you're paying close attention during that last shot of the two looking at each other, Obi-Wan is standing basking in light, while Anakin is steeped in shadow. One of the oddest, and yet most amazingly awesome characters introduced in the prequel trilogy is General Grievous. What exactly makes him so cool, you ask? Well, how about the fact that he uses not one, not two, but 4 freaking lightsabers? Yeah, you heard us. 4 lightsabers at once. That's pretty cool. And his fight scene with Obi-Wan is not bad either, made even more so by the fact that it is basically one giant bit of foreshadowing. Before facing Grievous, Obi-Wan is stalking around in the shadows, much like he does when he is in exile before A New Hope. And Grievous, like Vader in that film later on, fails to understand the true nature and raw power of the light side of the Force, thinking that sheer slicing prowess is enough to make him a match for the older Jedi. Haha, you sure showed them. Wait, does becoming a ghost count? I'm gonna say it counts. Finally, we have one of the best shots in the entire prequel trilogy, the last one. You know that awesome shot from A New Hope of Luke looking over a beautiful twin sunset on that planet Tatooine, staring off into a future that, to him, seems rather closed off? The sun was setting on his hopes and his dreams of joining the Academy. Revenge of the Sith had a very similar shot, with Owen and Beru holding the infant Luke on that same ridge on Tatooine. Only this time, they're looking at a sunrise. This may seem simple and really arbitrary, but it's representative of the hope that Luke represents for the galaxy. The day was nearly starting, and the future was bright. Seems like the prequel films may have been a bit more well thought out than some people give them credit. Did you catch all of these moments? Let us know in the comments below. While you're down there, why not consider subscribing to Screen Rant for more awesome videos? Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you at the movies.